There are moments in history when faith becomes dangerous, when belief requires not just devotion, but secrecy, when the choice to follow what is right could cost you everything you have built, everything you are known for, and perhaps even your life itself. This is a story about one of those moments, not a story of miracles in the public square, not a tale of prophets calling down fire or kings falling to their knees in repentance. This is something quieter, something that happened in the darkness of caves, in the silence of midnight deliveries, in the trembling hands of a man who chose obedience when no one was watching. Because sometimes the greatest acts of faith are the ones that go completely unseen. Sometimes courage looks like feeding the hungry when the queen wants them dead. Sometimes righteousness means standing in the shadows while history unfolds around you. Sometimes God uses not the voices that echo from mountaintops, but the footsteps that move silently through the night. This is the story of Obadiah, a name most have never heard. A man whose actions preserved the very voice of God during Israel's darkest hour. And it begins, as all such stories do, in a time when choosing right meant choosing risk. Chapter 1. A kingdom turned against heaven. The northern kingdom of Israel had known better days. There had been a time when the tribes gathered in worship, when the festivals brought joy, when prophets spoke and kings listened. But those days felt distant now, like memories from someone else's life. The kingdom that King Ahab ruled bore little resemblance to the nation his ancestors had built. Ahab was not the worst king Israel had ever known, but he was perhaps the most dangerous. Not because he was particularly cruel by nature, but because he was weak in the places where strength mattered most. He could command armies and manage territories, but he could not command his own household. He could not stand against the will of the woman who shared his throne, Jezebel. Her name alone was enough to make faithful Israelites lower their voices. A Phoenician princess, daughter of the king of Sidon, she had brought with her not just political alliance but religious fervour. She worshipped Baal with the kind of devotion that should have been reserved for the God of Israel. And she did not simply worship quietly in her private chambers. Jezebel was a woman of action, of absolute conviction, and of terrifying influence. She had brought hundreds of prophets of Baal into Israel. They ate at her table, spoke with her authority, and moved through the kingdom like an occupying force. Temples to foreign gods appeared in cities that had once hosted celebrations of the Lord. Altars to Asherah sprouted like weeds across the countryside. But that was not the worst of it. Jezebel did not simply promote her gods. She actively worked to eliminate the competition. The prophets of the God of Israel, those who still dared to speak his words, found themselves hunted. Some fled to the wilderness. Others were captured and executed. Their crime was simple. They refused to be silent about the truth. The message was clear. In Ahab's Israel, faith in the God of Abraham was becoming not just unpopular, but dangerous. The palace in Samaria reflected this new reality. Where once advisors might have consulted with priests and prophets, now they looked to Jezebel's imported spiritual counselors. Where once the king might have sought wisdom from those who followed the ancient ways, now he deferred to his wife's preferences. The very heart of the kingdom had shifted. And in that palace, walking the halls of power, moving through rooms where decisions of life and death were made daily, was a man caught between two worlds. His name was Obadiah. To understand the full weight of what Obadiah would eventually do, you must first understand what he was witnessing. The transformation of Israel was not happening overnight. It was a gradual erosion, each day bringing small changes that accumulated into something monstrous. At first, the arrival of Jezebel's prophets seemed like a cultural exchange. Foreign priests joining the royal court was not unprecedented. Many kings maintained diverse spiritual advisors, but these prophets of Baal were different. They did not simply offer alternative perspectives, they demanded exclusive authority. Obadiah watched as familiar faces disappeared from palace life. Advisors who had served for decades were quietly replaced. Officials known for their devotion to the God of Israel found themselves reassigned to remote posts or encouraged to retire. The purge was subtle at first, conducted with bureaucratic efficiency rather than violent spectacle. But the violence came, the first prophet was killed in a small town north of Samaria. The official story was that he had been caught in some criminal activity, though the details were vague and contradictory. Those who knew the man knew better. He had been speaking publicly about the dangers of Baal worship, calling on Israel to remember their covenant with the Lord. His death was a message. More followed. Some were arrested on fabricated charges, others simply disappeared, their families left to wonder whether they had fled or been killed. The pattern became clear to anyone paying attention. Speak for the God of Israel, and you became a target. Obadiah heard the reports with growing horror. He knew some of these men personally. They were not rabble-rousers or political agitators. They were teachers, scholars, men devoted to preserving the wisdom and laws that had guided Israel for generations. Their only crime was refusing to bend their knee to foreign gods. Palace life continued with a strange normalcy. Servants still cleaned the halls. Guards still maintained their posts. Officials still processed the endless administrative tasks that kept a kingdom functioning. But underneath the routine, everyone felt the change. Conversations became more guarded. People watched what they said and to whom they said it. Jezebel herself was rarely seen outside her private chambers, but her influence permeated everything. She did not need to give direct orders to every soldier or official. Her wishes were known, and those who wanted to advance in the new order made sure to anticipate and fulfill them. The construction of new temples accelerated. Massive structures rose in cities across Israel, dedicated to Baal and Asherah. The architecture was impressive, the ceremonies elaborate. Resources that might have gone to maintaining infrastructure or helping the poor were instead directed toward these monuments to foreign gods. And with each new temple came new priests, new ceremonies, new expectations for the population. Attendance at Baal festivals became an informal requirement for anyone seeking government positions or royal favour. Merchants found that displaying symbols of the new religious order was good for business. The social pressure to conform was immense. Those who resisted found themselves isolated. Families divided over the question of which gods to worship. Friendships ended. Communities that had been united for generations fractured along religious lines. Obadiah saw it all from his position in the palace. He processed the paperwork for temple construction. He coordinated the logistics for religious festivals. He managed resources that supported a system he privately despised. Every day he went to work knowing he was part of the machinery destroying what he believed in. The internal conflict was constant. Should he resign? Take a stand and suffer the consequences? Flee to Judah in the south where the worship of the Lord still held? The questions tormented him during long sleepless nights, but something kept him in place. Perhaps it was the practical understanding that his position gave him access to information and resources. Perhaps it was the sense that abandoning his post would accomplish nothing except removing one faithful person from a place of influence. Or perhaps it was simply that he had not yet been given a clear calling to leave. So he stayed. He performed his duties with excellence. He navigated the complex politics of a corrupt court. And he prayed that someday, somehow, he might be able to do something that mattered. He did not know that the opportunity was coming, that the very position he questioned, the role that felt like compromise, would become essential to saving lives. Persecution intensified as Jezebel's confidence grew. Early killings had been somewhat hidden, disguised as other crimes or accidents. But as resistance collapsed, the violence became more open. Prophets were hunted publicly. Rewards were offered for information leading to their capture. Soldiers conducted house-to-house searches in towns suspected of harbouring faithful teachers. The message was clear and brutal. There was no room in Israel for those who would not bow to Baal. Some prophets recanted. Under threat of death, watching their families endangered, they publicly renounced their teachings and pledged allegiance to the new religious order. These conversions were celebrated, held up as examples of enlightenment and wisdom. Others refused. They stood firm even as soldiers came for them. Their executions were meant to terrify any who might consider following their example. And a third group simply vanished. They fled into the wilderness, hid in remote areas, sought refuge wherever they could find it. These were the survivors, the ones who refused to compromise but recognized that martyrdom would accomplish nothing if it silenced the truth entirely. It was these hidden, hunted prophets who needed help, who needed food, shelter, protection, who needed someone with the resources and access to risk everything for their survival. They needed Obadiah. He just did not know it yet. Chapter 2. The Believer in the Palace. To look at Obadiah, you would never suspect what lived in his heart. He dressed like a palace official because he was one. He spoke with the measured tones of someone accustomed to authority because he held significant authority. As the palace administrator, he managed the entire royal household. Every detail of palace life, from the kitchens to the stables, from the treasury to the guard rotations, passed through his hands. He was trusted, efficient, and seemingly loyal to the crown he served. King Ahab relied on him completely. The king was not a detail-oriented man. He preferred grand strategy and political maneuvering to the mundane work of actually running a kingdom. Obadiah filled that gap perfectly. He ensured that the palace functioned smoothly, that supplies were managed, that the countless moving parts of royal administration meshed together seamlessly. Jezebel, always suspicious of those around her husband, had never questioned Obadiah's position. He performed his duties flawlessly. He caused no trouble. He raised no objections to the changes sweeping through Israel. When she demanded resources for her temples, Obadiah found them. When she required logistics for her religious festivals, Obadiah coordinated them. He was, from her perspective, exactly what an administrator should be. Competent and compliant. At least that is what she saw. But every morning, before the palace stirred to life, Obadiah would stand alone in his private chambers and pray to the God his nation was abandoning. Every evening, after the demands of his position were met, he would read from scrolls of scripture he kept hidden among his possessions. And every day, walking through halls adorned with symbols of foreign gods, he would feel the weight of what he was witnessing. He was a man of deep, quiet faith, living in the center of a system designed to destroy exactly that kind of faith. The contradiction was not lost on him. There were nights when he lay awake, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Was he compromising by staying? Should he flee, join those who had abandoned their positions rather than serve under such corruption? Was his presence in the palace a form of complicity? The arguments he had with himself during those dark hours were brutal and honest. On one side, the voice that said remaining in such a place was a betrayal of everything he believed, that by facilitating the palace operations, even in mundane administrative tasks, he was supporting a regime that killed prophets and promoted false gods, that his prayers in private chambers meant nothing if his public life contributed to evil. On the other side, the quieter but persistent voice that suggested God might have a reason for placing him exactly where he was, that someone faithful needed to maintain influence in these halls, that walking away would accomplish nothing except removing one righteous person from a position where they might, someday, make a difference. Both voices had merit, both carried weight, and neither offered the kind of certainty that would have made the decision easy. So Obadiah continued in tension, never quite at peace with his position, but unable to abandon it. He performed his duties with the excellence that his faith demanded, even in secular work. He treated servants and officials with the dignity that his beliefs taught all people deserved. He managed resources with the integrity that reflected his understanding of God's character. But he also learned to be careful, to guard his words, to never let his private devotion show in ways that might endanger him or limit his effectiveness. He became skilled at the art of appearing neutral, while holding strong convictions privately. It was a lonely way to live. He could not confide in other palace officials. Most had either genuinely embraced the new religious order or were pragmatically going along with it. A few might have shared his faith, but identifying them was dangerous. One wrong conversation could lead to exposure, and exposure meant death. Even outside the palace, relationships became complicated. Old friends from earlier times, people who had known Obadiah before Jezebel's reforms, looked at him with suspicion. How could someone truly faithful to the Lord continue serving in Ahab's court? How could he participate in palace life without compromising his beliefs? He had no good answer for them. Or rather, he had answers, but they sounded like excuses even to his own ears. That he was doing what he could, that his position might prove useful someday, that leaving would change nothing. The truth was messier than any simple explanation could capture. He was neither a hero nor a collaborator. He was a man trying to navigate impossible circumstances while clinging to faith in a God who seemed increasingly silent about what he should do. His daily routine was carefully structured to maintain both his public effectiveness and his private devotion. He woke before dawn, using the quiet hours for prayer and scripture reading. He kept his scrolls hidden in a locked chest, disguised among administrative documents. If anyone searched his chambers, they would find nothing obviously incriminating. The prayers themselves were often more questions than statements, requests for wisdom, pleas for guidance, confessions of doubt and fear. He did not approach God with the confidence of someone certain they were doing right. He approached with the desperation of someone trying to remain faithful in circumstances that made faithfulness feel impossible. After prayers came preparation for the day, dressing in the fine robes appropriate to his position, reviewing the schedule of tasks and meetings, mentally preparing to interact with people whose values he did not share, but whose authority he had to respect. The work itself was demanding. Managing a royal household in any era required skill, but doing so during a time of religious transformation and growing drought added layers of complexity. Resources had to be allocated carefully. Competing demands had to be balanced. The Queen's priorities often conflicted with practical necessities, and Obadiah had to navigate those tensions without appearing to oppose her will. He became expert at finding solutions that technically met requirements, while minimizing his own involvement in things that violated his conscience. When Jezebel demanded resources for another Baal temple, Obadiah would provide exactly what was requested, nothing more. When festivals required coordination, he would handle logistics without participating in ceremonies. It was a constant exercise in threading needles, finding the narrow path between outright refusal and enthusiastic support. He did enough to maintain his position and avoid suspicion, but not so much that he felt he was actively advancing evil. The other palace officials noticed his competence but not his convictions. He was valuable, precisely because he was reliable and efficient. He made the complex machinery of royal administration function smoothly. That value provided some protection. Even Jezebel, who trusted few people, recognized that replacing Obadiah would create problems she did not want to deal with. But that protection was thin and contingent. One wrong word, one moment of exposed faith, and it would evaporate. Obadiah lived with that reality every day. The servants under his authority presented a different challenge. Some were faithful to the Lord, quietly maintaining their beliefs despite the changing times. Others had embraced Baal worship, either sincerely or pragmatically, and many were simply trying to survive, not thinking too deeply about theological questions when they had families to feed. Obadiah treated all of them fairly, which itself was a form of witness. In a culture increasingly characterized by favoritism and corruption, his consistent integrity stood out. He did not punish servants for their religious choices. He did not demand participation in ceremonies. He simply expected honest work and treated people with respect. Some noticed. A few servants who shared his faith recognized the signs. They saw how he avoided certain phrases common among Baal worshippers. They noticed he never wore the religious symbols that others displayed. They observed his fairness and kindness in a place where those qualities were becoming rare. These servants became his informal network, though he never explicitly acknowledged it. They were loyal not just because he was their superior, but because they recognized in him something they valued. That loyalty would prove crucial when the time came for action. But for now, it was simply the daily reality of a man maintaining faith in hostile territory, performing his duties, protecting his beliefs, waiting for he knew not what. The palace itself felt like a spiritual battleground. Walking through halls decorated with images of Baal and Asherah was a daily assault on Obadiah's faith. The sounds of foreign religious music, the smells of incense offered to false gods, the conversations celebrating what he knew was wrong, all of it created a constant pressure. He developed mental techniques for survival. When walking past religious imagery, he would pray silently, reminding himself of truth. When conversations turned to praise of the new order, he would find ways to excuse himself or remain silent. When required to attend certain palace functions, he would position himself at the edges, present but not participating. It was exhausting. The mental and spiritual energy required to maintain his double existence drained him. There were days when he seriously considered whether it was worth it, whether he should just give up, either by conforming publicly or by fleeing entirely. But he never quite reached the breaking point. Something always pulled him back. A verse of scripture remembered at the right moment, a small kindness from a fellow believer, a sense, impossible to verify but persistent nonetheless, that he was meant to be exactly where he was. And then came the day when everything changed, when the rumours started spreading through the palace, when Jezebel's persecution of the prophets escalated from hunting individuals to systematic extermination. When Obadiah realised that his position, the one he had questioned and struggled with for so long, was about to become the instrument of salvation for 100 men. Chapter 3. The Quiet Rescue. The order came through official channels, which made it all the more chilling. Jezebel had decided that eliminating prophets one by one was inefficient. She wanted them all dead, and she wanted it done quickly. The decree went out to military commanders, provincial governors, local officials. Find the prophets of the Lord and execute them. Rewards would be given for information. Punishment would fall on anyone found harbouring them. It was systematic genocide, dressed in the language of administrative efficiency. Obadiah received the directive as part of his regular briefings. The palace administrator needed to know about major military and civil operations. He read the words with a calmness that surprised him, even as his mind began racing. Around him, other officials discussed logistics and timelines. No one seemed troubled by what they were planning. He excused himself, claiming he needed to review supply inventories. No one questioned it. He walked through the palace with measured steps, his face betraying nothing, until he reached his private chambers. Only then did he let the mask drop. His hands were shaking. 100 thoughts competed for attention. Horror at what was about to happen. Rage at the injustice. Fear of what it meant for the few faithful who remained. And underneath it all, a growing conviction that he could not simply stand by. But what could one man do? He was an administrator, not a warrior. He had no army, no power to countermand the Queen's orders. He could not stop the persecution. But perhaps he could save some from it. The idea formed slowly, pieced together from fragments of knowledge and desperate calculation. He knew of caves in the hills outside Samaria. He had access to palace resources. He had the authority to move supplies without extensive oversight. He had a network of servants who trusted him. If he was very careful, very clever, and very lucky, he might be able to hide some of the prophets. Not all of them. He could not reach everyone in time or protect unlimited numbers, but some, a significant number, enough to ensure that when this dark time passed, the voice of God would not be completely silenced. The plan came together over several sleepless nights. He would identify caves suitable for long-term hiding. He would make contact with prophets who had not yet fled or been captured. He would arrange transportation to the hiding places. He would establish a system for regular supply deliveries. All of it done in absolute secrecy, using his position to mask activities that would mean death if discovered. It was ambitious. It was dangerous. It was probably impossible. He decided to do it anyway. The caves were the easy part. He knew the territory around Samaria well, having travelled it extensively during his years in palace service. There were 2 cave systems in particular that would work. They were remote enough to avoid casual discovery, but close enough that he could reach them regularly. They had multiple chambers, providing space for groups to live. They had natural water sources, at least in normal times. Obadiah began visiting them under the guise of surveying royal lands. He brought trusted servants along. framing the trips as assessments for potential agricultural use. What he was actually doing was mapping the caves, determining how many people each could support, identifying the best routes for bringing supplies without leaving obvious trails. Making contact with the prophets was harder and more dangerous. He could not simply walk up to them publicly. Many were already in hiding or on the run. Those still visible were under surveillance by Jezebel's agents. He used intermediaries, servants who were faithful to the Lord and trusted by their communities. Messages were passed in whispers, in crowded markets where conversations could not be overheard, in brief encounters that looked accidental. The content was always vague enough to maintain deniability, but clear enough for those who needed to understand. There is a place of safety. Resources are available. Trust is required. Not everyone who received the message believed it. Some thought it was a trap, a way to lure prophets out of hiding. Others were too afraid to take the risk of contact. Still others had already fled too far to be reached. But slowly, carefully, a network formed. Prophets who received the message would pass it to others they trusted. Meeting points were established. Plans were made for moving people in small groups under cover of darkness. Obadiah coordinated it all while maintaining his palace duties. During the day, he was the efficient administrator, processing paperwork, managing staff, attending meetings. At night, he became something else entirely, a conspirator, a rescuer, a man risking everything for people most of his colleagues wanted dead. The first group arrived at the caves on a moonless night. Obadiah was there to meet them, along with 2 servants he trusted absolutely. The prophets looked exhausted and terrified. Some were injured from narrow escapes, others were sick from days of difficult travel with inadequate food. He got them settled in the cave, distributed supplies he'd brought, explained how things would work. They would stay hidden during daylight. He would bring food and water regularly, though he could not promise daily deliveries. They needed to be completely silent about the location. One captured prophet who knew where the caves were could doom everyone. The prophets listened with the desperate focus of people whose lives depended on understanding instructions. Some wept, overwhelmed by the shift from hunted fugitives to relative safety. Others asked practical questions about water sources and waste management. All of them were deeply grateful, though they barely knew who Obadiah was or why he was doing this. He did not explain. There was no time for theological discussions or personal testimonies. He gave them what they needed, promised to return, and disappeared back into the darkness. More groups followed over the next weeks. Never large gatherings that might attract attention. Always small numbers, arriving at different times using varied routes. Obadiah divided them between the 2 cave systems, 50 prophets in each location. The separation provided insurance. If one cave was discovered, the other might survive. Provisioning them became the consuming focus of his life. Every meal in the palace, he would calculate how much food could be diverted without being noticed. Every inventory report, he would find ways to account for small shortages. Every supply delivery, he would arrange for certain items to be routed through him personally. It required constant creativity. He could not simply take large quantities from palace storehouses. That would be noticed immediately. Instead, he worked in small increments. A few loaves of bread here, a skin of wine there, dried fish, dates, grain, oil. All in amounts that could be explained as waste, or personal use, or legitimate palace business. He developed a network of suppliers outside the palace. Merchants who were faithful to the Lord and willing to help, though they did not know the full scope of what they were supporting. He would purchase goods using his own resources, then store them in places he could access during his trips to the caves. The logistics were mind-bending. He had to track what each cave needed, calculate how much he could safely divert from various sources, plan routes that would not attract attention, time his visits to avoid suspicious patterns, and do all of it while maintaining his palace responsibilities at the same level of excellence everyone expected. There were near disasters, times when palace audits came uncomfortably close to exposing discrepancies, moments when servants almost stumbled onto the truth, occasions when Obadiah's absences from the palace at odd hours raised questions. He developed cover stories for everything. He was checking on royal livestock in remote pastures. He was surveying land for potential development. He was meeting with local officials about administrative matters. The lies came more easily than he wanted them to, and he prayed constantly for forgiveness even as he spoke them. Because what else could he do? Tell the truth and watch 100 men die? The caves themselves developed into small communities. The prophets organised themselves out of necessity. They established routines for prayer and study. They divided responsibilities for managing the limited space and resources. They supported each other through the psychological strain of hiding. But it was hard. Living in caves, unable to see the sun freely, dependent entirely on one man's ability to keep bringing supplies, it wore on them. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, magnified by stress and confinement. Some struggled with claustrophobia, others battled depression. A few questioned whether this was really God's will, whether they should emerge and face their fate rather than living like animals in darkness. Obadiah heard all of it during his supply visits. He was not equipped to handle pastoral counselling. He was an administrator, not a spiritual leader. But these men needed more than food. They needed encouragement, hope, some assurance that what they were enduring had meaning. He did what he could. He assured them their sacrifice mattered. He reminded them that staying alive meant the word of God would not be silenced. He brought news from outside, carefully filtered to avoid causing panic about the true extent of the persecution, and he prayed with them. Simple prayers, nothing eloquent or prophetic, just the prayers of a man asking God to sustain people he was trying to help. The routine became his life. Palace work during the day, cave visits at night, or in whatever hours he could steal. Constant vigilance to ensure nothing exposed the operation. It was exhausting on every level, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, but he continued. Week after week, month after month, the 100 prophets needed to eat, and he was the only one providing for them. There were moments when the full weight of what he had undertaken crushed him. Lying in his chambers after a particularly difficult day, his body aching from another supply run, his mind spinning with the logistics of tomorrow's needs, he would wonder how long he could sustain this. How long before he made a mistake? How long before someone discovered the truth? How long before the burden simply broke him? But morning would come, and with it the needs that could not wait. The prophets were still hidden, still dependent, still alive because of what he was doing. So he would rise and continue. No recognition, no validation, no certainty that what he was doing would ultimately matter in the grand scope of Israel's history. Just faith expressed in the steady repetition of dangerous obedience, bringing bread to caves, carrying water through darkness, keeping 100 prophets alive while a queen wanted them dead, day after day, night after night, year after year, until either the crisis passed or he was discovered, whichever came first. Chapter 4. Faith without recognition. Living a double life creates a particular kind of exhaustion. It is not just the physical demands, though those were significant. It is the constant mental calculation required to maintain two separate realities: the palace, administrator and the secret rescuer, the efficient servant of the crown and the underground resistance, the man everyone saw and the man no one knew existed. Obadiah felt the split in his soul. Sometimes he would be in the middle of a palace meeting discussing grain storage or guard rotations, and his mind would drift to the caves. Were the prophets running low on supplies? Had anyone fallen ill? Was there enough water given the drought that was beginning to grip the land? Then he would force himself back to the present, to the conversation happening around him, terrified that someone had noticed his distraction. But no one ever did. To them, he was simply Obadiah, perhaps tired from his demanding work, but still reliable, still competent. The servants under his authority provided some comfort, though he could never be fully open even with those who shared his faith. But they knew something, even if not the details. They saw how he treated people with kindness in a place increasingly characterized by cruelty. They noticed his integrity in a court rife with corruption. They recognized the quiet signs of someone whose beliefs ran deeper than the surface compliance required for survival. A few servants became essential to his work without fully understanding what they were supporting. He would send them on errands that seemed routine but actually served to move supplies toward the caves. They would handle deliveries that appeared to be normal palace business but actually stockpiled resources he would later transport. These servants never asked too many questions. Perhaps they guessed something was happening. Perhaps they chose not to know the details so they could not be forced to betray them. Or perhaps they simply trusted that Obadiah's requests, however unusual, served some good purpose. One servant in particular, a young man named Nathaniel, became indispensable. He was zealous for the Lord, almost dangerously so in such times. Obadiah had to constantly caution him about being more careful, less vocal about his beliefs. But that same zeal made him absolutely reliable when Obadiah needed help. Nathaniel would accompany Obadiah on some of the supply runs, officially serving as his assistant on surveying trips or administrative inspections. The young man never saw inside the caves, never met the prophets directly, but he helped carry loads and keep watch while Obadiah made deliveries. After one particularly close call, when palace guards had questioned why they were travelling at such an odd hour, Nathaniel had pulled Obadiah aside. "I do not need to know what you're doing," he had said quietly, "but I trust you, and whatever it is, I will help however I can." It was as close as Obadiah came to having a confidant. Not someone who knew everything, but someone who supported him without needing full disclosure. That trust, that willingness to help without demanding explanations, was a gift in a time when trust was dangerously scarce. But even with Nathaniel's help, the work was brutally demanding. The drought that had begun subtly was now impossible to ignore. Water sources were drying up, crops were failing, food was becoming expensive and scarce. For Obadiah, this created new complications. Diverting food when it was abundant was one thing. Diverting it during a famine was something else entirely. Every loaf of bread, every measure of grain was now precious. Palace officials watched supplies with sharp eyes, accounting for everything with increasing precision. He had to become even more creative, even more careful. He reduced the frequency of deliveries to the caves, stretching supplies as far as possible. He instructed the prophets to ration strictly. He searched for alternative sources, small farmers or merchants who might have hidden reserves and were willing to help. The prophets themselves felt the strain. Their portions shrank. Hunger became a constant companion. Some lost significant weight. Others showed signs of malnutrition. The caves that had been places of safety began to feel like slow starvation. Obadiah brought them what he could, but it was never enough. He saw the desperation in their eyes, heard the weakness in their voices, and he carried that home with him each time, the knowledge that men were suffering because he could not do more. There were nights when he lay awake calculating. If he diverted more food, the palace audits would catch it. If he diverted less, prophets would starve. There was no solution that did not involve terrible risk or terrible consequences. He chose to take the risk. He pushed the boundaries of what he could safely take. He accepted that eventually, if the drought continued, he would likely be caught. But better that than watching men die of hunger when he might have saved them. The palace itself was feeling the drought's effects. Even with all the resources of the kingdom, even with emergency stores and access to whatever food could still be found, there was not enough. Servants were put on reduced rations. Livestock began dying. The abundance that palace life had always known was gone. King Ahab grew increasingly desperate. He could see his kingdom withering. The people were suffering. His own household was affected. And Jezebel's prophets of Baal, for all their elaborate ceremonies and passionate prayers, had produced no rain. Obadiah watched the king's growing panic with mixed feelings. On one hand, Ahab's suffering was a form of justice for the evil he had allowed. On the other hand, the king's desperation made palace life even more unpredictable and dangerous. Ahab was capable of lashing out, of making decisions driven by fear rather than reason. During this time, Obadiah maintained his public duties with the same excellence everyone had come to expect. He managed the household efficiently even as resources shrank. He coordinated responses to the drought's effects. He advised the king on practical matters. with the same competence he had always shown. But at night in his chambers, he was someone else entirely. A man barely holding together. A man carrying burdens no one else could see. A man who prayed desperately for strength to continue, for wisdom to navigate impossible situations, for mercy toward people he was trying to save. The prophets in the caves had no idea how close to the edge everything was. They only knew that Obadiah's visits became less frequent, the supplies smaller, the situation more dire. They prayed for rain, for the drought to end, for deliverance from their hiding. And they prayed for Obadiah, though most did not even know his name. They prayed for the one who provides, the mysterious benefactor whose identity was kept secret even from them. They asked God to protect whoever was risking everything to keep them alive. Obadiah would have been moved by those prayers if he had known about them, but he was too busy, too exhausted, too focused on the next delivery to think about whether anyone was praying for him. All he knew was that 100 men needed food, and he was the only one who could provide it. The fact that providing it might eventually kill him was irrelevant. What else could he do? So he continued, pushing through exhaustion, managing impossible logistics, lying to colleagues to protect truth, stealing to preserve life, breaking rules to maintain righteousness. It was faith without any of the comforts that usually accompany faith. No miracles to encourage him, no signs from heaven to confirm he was doing right, no community to share the burden, no recognition to sustain morale, just the grinding daily work of keeping people alive. The same work, repeated endlessly, with no guarantee it would ever amount to anything beyond postponing death for a while. But he did it anyway, because faith, real faith, the kind that survives in the shadows, does not depend on recognition or results. It depends on choosing obedience in the moment, then choosing it again the next moment, then again, over and over, until either the crisis passes or you can no longer continue. Obadiah was not yet at the point where he could no longer continue, so he kept going, day after day, night after night, carrying the secret that could destroy him, bearing the weight of lives that depended on him, seen by God, seen by no one else, and somehow finding that enough to take the next step. Chapter 5. The Land in Drought. By the third year, the drought had transformed Israel into something almost unrecognizable. Fields that had once yielded abundant harvests were now expanses of cracked earth. Trees that had provided fruit for generations stood bare and dying. The rivers that had watered the land since ancient times were reduced to dry channels of stone and dust. Everywhere you looked, the evidence of judgment was inescapable. The human cost was staggering. Famine gripped every town and village. Children cried from hunger. The elderly, weakened by malnutrition, died in numbers that overwhelmed burial customs. Families fought over scraps of food. Communities that had once been prosperous were reduced to desperate survival. Animals died by the thousands. Livestock that represented generations of breeding and wealth simply collapsed and did not rise again. Horses that had pulled chariots and ploughs became too weak to work. Even the wild creatures seemed to be disappearing, unable to find food or water in the devastated landscape. The economic impact rippled through every level of society. Merchants who traded in agricultural goods went bankrupt. Farmers who had owned land for generations lost everything. The tax base that supported the kingdom eroded as people had nothing left to give. Even the wealthy felt the pinch as money became meaningless when there was simply no food to buy. In Samaria, the capital struggled to maintain any semblance of normal function. The palace, which had always seemed immune to the problems affecting, common people could no longer pretend the crisis was not real. Storehouses were nearly empty. The royal household, accustomed to abundance, faced genuine scarcity. Obadiah managed all of this with the same efficiency he brought to everything, but the challenge was unlike anything he had faced before. How do you administer a palace when there are no supplies to administer? How do you feed servants when there is no food? How do you maintain order when everyone is desperate? He did what he could. He implemented strict rationing. He prioritized the most essential functions. He searched constantly for any source of supplies that might still exist. but it was like trying to hold back the tide with his hands, and through it all he still had to feed 100 prophets hiding in caves. The impossibility of that task had become almost absurd. He was struggling to feed the palace staff with all the resources of the kingdom at his disposal. How could he possibly continue supporting a secret operation that drained what little he could access? But abandoning the prophets was not an option. They had survived this long because of his efforts. To stop now would be to condemn them to death after everything they had endured. So he made impossible choices. He took food from his own rations and added it to what he brought the caves. He convinced Nathaniel and a few other trusted servants to do the same. Together they cobbled together enough to keep the prophets barely alive, though barely alive was all it was. The visits to the caves became heartbreaking. The men there were shadows of who they had been. Gaunt faces, hollow eyes, bodies wasted by prolonged hunger. Some were sick with illnesses that malnutrition made impossible to fight. Others showed signs of giving up, the spiritual vitality that had sustained them through hiding, draining away under the physical demands of starvation. They still prayed, still studied scripture, still encouraged each other, but it was harder now. Faith under pressure reveals character, but it also reveals limits. These men were reaching their limits. Obadiah would sit with them during his visits, offering what comfort he could. But what comfort was there? He could not promise rain. He could not guarantee survival. All he could offer was the assurance that they were not forgotten, that someone was still trying, still caring, still doing whatever was humanly possible. Sometimes that was enough to revive spirits for a while. Other times, he could see it was not. He would leave the caves carrying the weight of men's despair along with everything else. Back at the palace, King Ahab was becoming increasingly irrational. The drought was destroying his kingdom, and he was powerless to stop it. His wife's prophets had failed to bring rain despite countless ceremonies. The people were suffering, and their suffering was eroding any loyalty they might have felt toward the crown. Ahab needed someone to blame. He fixed on the prophet, Elijah, the man who had declared this drought before disappearing. If Elijah could be found and killed, perhaps the curse would end. Ahab sent soldiers across Israel and into neighbouring kingdoms searching for the prophet. He sent letters to other rulers demanding they surrender Elijah if he was in their territories. But Elijah had vanished completely. Some thought he was dead. Others whispered that God was hiding him. Wherever he was, Ahab's increasingly desperate search could not find him. The king's frustration found other outlets. He became suspicious of those around him, questioning loyalties, demanding absolute obedience. Palace life, already tense under Jezebel's influence, became paranoid and dangerous. Obadiah navigated this environment with the political skill he had developed over years of palace service. He stayed useful, staying visible enough to avoid suspicion, but not so prominent as to become a target. It required constant attention to the shifting dynamics of court, politics. The strain was showing on everyone. Servants moved through the halls with haunted expressions. Officials snapped at each other over trivial matters. Even Jezebel, usually so confident and commanding, seemed affected by the knowledge that her religious reforms had not prevented the disaster engulfing Israel. Then came the day when Ahab summoned Obadiah with a new plan. "The animals are dying," the king said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had not slept well in months. "If we lose all the horses and mules, we lose any ability to defend ourselves or maintain order. We must find grassland, any patch that might have enough vegetation to keep some of them alive." He explained his plan. He and Obadiah would divide the kingdom between them and search personally. It was a task that should have been delegated to minor officials, but Ahab trusted no one else to take it seriously enough. "You go one direction," Ahab instructed. "I will go another. Search every valley, every water source, anything that might still support grazing. Report back anything you find." Obadiah agreed immediately, recognizing he had no choice. But as he prepared for the search, his mind was racing with complications. This meant extended time away from the palace, extended time travelling through the countryside. Both were dangerous for someone maintaining secret cave operations, but perhaps, he thought, it also presented opportunities. If he was officially searching for grassland, his presence in remote areas would have legitimate explanation. He might be able to check on the caves more thoroughly than his usual rushed visits allowed. He might find resources other areas had missed. He gathered supplies for the journey, coordinating with Nathaniel to ensure the palace would function in his absence. He reviewed routes that would accomplish the king's objectives while also allowing him to reach the caves. He prepared explanations for any unusual movements should he be observed, and then he set out into a devastated landscape, searching for grass that probably did not exist while carrying the burden of secrets that could not be revealed. He had been travelling for days when he saw the figure approaching from the distance. Just a man walking through the wasteland, which was strange enough. But as the figure drew closer, Obadiah felt recognition strike him with physical force. It was Elijah. The prophet Ahab was desperately seeking. The man whose words had brought this drought. The person whose very existence represented danger to anyone who encountered him. Walking straight toward Obadiah, as if this meeting was planned. Chapter 6. An unexpected encounter. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Obadiah stood frozen in the dusty road, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. Every rational thought said this could not be happening. Elijah was either dead or in hiding so deep that no one could find him. He certainly should not be casually walking through open territory where anyone might see him. Yet here he was, real, solid, walking with the kind of confidence that suggested he had nothing to fear, despite being the most wanted man in Israel. As Elijah approached, Obadiah found himself evaluating the prophet with the detailed attention fear brings. He looked surprisingly healthy for someone who had been hiding during a 3-year famine. His clothes were worn but adequate. His face showed none of the gauntness that marked most people after years of food scarcity. Whatever God was doing to sustain him, it was clearly effective. When Elijah spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "Is that you, Obadiah?" The use of his name made it personal. This was not a random encounter. Elijah knew who he was talking to. That realization brought a new layer of fear. If Elijah knew Obadiah, what else did he know? Did he know about the caves? About the hidden prophets? Obadiah bowed, the gesture automatic despite his shock. "It is I, my lord Elijah." The formal address created some distance, reminded them both of their respective positions. Obadiah was a palace official. Elijah was a prophet of God. The interaction had structure, protocol. That structure felt safer than the raw reality of their situation. But the fear was overwhelming. Obadiah's mind raced through scenarios, each worse than the last. If someone saw him talking to Elijah, he would be arrested as a collaborator. If soldiers came upon them, he would be assumed to be harbouring the prophet. His years of careful political navigation, his entire strategy of survival, could collapse in minutes because of this roadside conversation. The words that came out reflected that fear. "What have I done wrong that you would hand your servant over to Ahab to be killed?" It sounded paranoid even as he said it, but the concern was real. Elijah's presence was dangerous. Just being near him was dangerous. And if the prophet left and Ahab somehow heard about this encounter, Obadiah would have no way to prove he was not involved in hiding the very man the king wanted dead. Elijah did not seem offended by the question. If anything, there was understanding in his expression, as if he recognized the impossible position Obadiah occupied. "I swear by the living Lord your God," Elijah said, "there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to search for me. When they said you were not there, he made them swear they could not find me." Obadiah knew this was true. He had processed some of the official correspondence related to the search for Elijah. Ahab had been thorough, obsessive even, in his determination to locate the prophet. The international reach of the search was unprecedented, and now here Elijah stood in the open, apparently unconcerned. The prophet continued, "But now you tell me to go to my master and say Elijah is here. What if when I leave you, the Spirit of the Lord carries Elijah off somewhere I do not know about? Then when I go and tell Ahab and he cannot find you, he will kill me." It was exactly what Obadiah feared. The story was too convenient, too impossible to verify. Tell Ahab that Elijah was here, have the prophet disappear before the king arrived, and Obadiah would be blamed for the deception. Everything he had built, all the careful trust he had earned, his entire position that enabled him to help the hidden prophets, it would all be destroyed. And for what? A message that might be a cruel joke or a test he was failing. The fear and frustration poured out of him. All the weight he had been carrying, all the impossible demands, all the secrets and lies and constant danger, suddenly found a voice. "Yet I, your servant, have revered the Lord from my youth," he said, hearing his voice rise despite himself. "Was it not told to my Lord what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water." It came out in a rush, the secret he had told no one, the work that had consumed his life, the constant risk that defined his existence. He was not trying to boast or seek recognition. He was trying to make Elijah understand the stakes, the danger, the complexity of the position he occupied. "And now you tell me to go to my master and say Elijah is here? He will kill me!" The words hung in the air between them. Obadiah realized with a sinking feeling that he had just revealed everything to a man he barely knew. If Elijah was captured and tortured, he now knew about the caves. If Elijah told anyone, casually or intentionally, the secret was out. But it was too late to take the words back. They were spoken. The truth was exposed. Elijah listened to the entire outburst without interrupting. When Obadiah finally ran out of words, breathing hard from the emotional release, the prophet spoke with quiet conviction. "As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today." There was no doubt in his voice, no uncertainty, just complete confidence that what he said would happen exactly as he said. And somehow, despite everything, despite all the rational reasons to distrust this encounter, despite the fear and the risk and the impossibility of it all, Obadiah believed him. Perhaps it was the authority in Elijah's voice. Perhaps it was the recognition that a man who had survived 3 years of hiding through God's provision could be trusted when he made such a direct statement. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, the weariness of carrying so much alone making him willing to trust someone else to know what they were doing. Whatever the reason, Obadiah made a decision. He would go to Ahab. He would deliver the message. He would trust that God, who had sustained Elijah for 3 years and protected 100 prophets in caves, could manage this encounter as well. It felt like stepping off a cliff, like abandoning all the careful control that had kept him safe, like surrendering to something larger than his own ability to navigate danger. But he did it anyway. Chapter 7. A moment of testing. The journey back to find Ahab gave Obadiah time to question everything. What was he doing? He had just admitted to hiding prophets, admitting it to a man he encountered on a road, trusting that this would somehow work out. His entire strategy for survival had been discretion, careful political navigation, never revealing more than absolutely necessary. And in one conversation, he had thrown all of that away. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was foolishness, that he should turn around, find Elijah again, and tell him the message could not be delivered, that he should protect himself and the prophets by maintaining the secrecy that had kept them all alive. But another voice, quieter but more insistent, whispered that this moment had been coming all along, that all his careful work had been preparation for something, that God, who had been silent through years of difficulty, was now moving in ways that required trust beyond what Obadiah could see or control. He kept walking. King Ahab was exactly where Obadiah expected to find him, searching a dry valley for any sign of grass that might feed the dying royal herds. The king looked up as Obadiah approached, his expression shifting from exhaustion to something like hope when he saw his palace administrator. "Have you found anything?" Ahab asked before Obadiah could even offer a proper greeting. "No grassland, my lord." Obadiah paused, feeling the weight of the next words before they were spoken. "But I have found something else. I have seen Elijah. He is alive, and he says he will present himself to you today." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Ahab stood so quickly he stumbled. His face went through a rapid succession of expressions: shock, anger, hope, calculation, fear. Around them, the servants and guards who had accompanied the king went still, everyone understanding the significance of what had just been said. "Where?" The word came out as almost a demand. Obadiah gave the location where he had encountered Elijah. Ahab did not hesitate. He called for his chariot immediately, for guards, for attendants. The search for grassland was forgotten. Everything now focused on reaching the prophet who had brought drought to Israel. Within moments, the entire group was mobilized and moving. Obadiah found himself caught up in the rush, brought along as part of the royal entourage because he was the one who had encountered Elijah. He rode in a following chariot, watching the dust from Ahab's horses, his mind strangely quiet now that the decision was made and the consequences were unfolding. There was nothing left to do but watch what happened next. The journey back to the meeting point felt both endless and too fast. Obadiah found himself praying, not elaborate prayers, but simple, desperate requests. Let this work out. Let the prophets remain safe. Let my trust not be misplaced. Let whatever you are doing be worth the risk. When they reached the location, Elijah was there, just standing in the open, no protection, no escape route visible, waiting exactly as he had said he would be. The sight of the prophet standing calmly while the king's forces approached seemed to affect everyone differently. Some of the soldiers looked uncertain, as if they were not sure whether to be aggressive or cautious with a man who radiated such confidence. Ahab himself seemed almost hesitant as he dismounted from his chariot. The king who commanded armies looked uncertain as he approached the solitary prophet. When he spoke, his voice carried across the distance, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is that you, troubler of Israel?" It was an accusation and an acknowledgement. The person Ahab had been desperately seeking. The man blamed for 3 years of drought. The troublemaker who had disrupted the kingdom's carefully constructed new religious order. Elijah's response was immediate and sharp. "I have not troubled Israel. You have. You and your father's house. You have abandoned the commands of the Lord and followed the Baals." The confrontation was public now, not a private conversation between prophet and king, but a declaration made before officials and servants and guards, the kind of challenge that could not be ignored or minimized. What Elijah said next would become legendary. He proposed a test. Gather all Israel to Mount Carmel, bring the prophets of Baal, all 450 of them that ate at Jezebel's table. Let them prepare a sacrifice to their God. Let Elijah prepare a sacrifice to the Lord. The God who answered with fire consuming the sacrifice would be proven true. It was bold. It was dramatic. It was exactly the kind of public confrontation that would either vindicate faith in the Lord or destroy it completely. Ahab agreed without significant hesitation. Perhaps he thought his prophets would win. Perhaps he was desperate enough to try anything to end the drought. Perhaps he simply wanted resolution, whatever that meant. The king began giving orders immediately. Messengers were dispatched to gather the people. Officials were tasked with coordinating the assembly at Mount Carmel. The prophets of Baal were to be notified and brought. It would take days to arrange, but it was happening. Obadiah listened to all of this from his position among the attendants. His role in the drama was complete. He had delivered the message. He had brought the king to the prophet. Whatever happened next was beyond his control or participation. As the royal party began preparing to return to Samaria and organize the massive gathering, Obadiah found himself almost forgotten in the activity. No one was paying attention to the palace administrator anymore. All focus was on Elijah and the coming confrontation. He slipped away quietly, no longer needed for, whatever was coming. His official duty was complete. The search for grassland that Ahab had originally sent him on was obviously abandoned given these new circumstances. He was free to return to his other responsibilities. But first, he needed to check on the caves. The prophets there needed to know what was happening, that something significant was unfolding, that the prophet Elijah, who had been hidden by God, had emerged, that a confrontation was coming that might change everything. Obadiah made his way to the nearest cave system. taking the paths he had travelled so many times in darkness. This time he came in daylight, too exhausted and emotionally spent to worry about the additional risk. The prophets saw immediately that something was different. Obadiah looked shaken in a way they had never seen before. When he told them about the encounter with Elijah, about the message delivered to Ahab, about the planned gathering at Mount Carmel, they responded with a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that God was finally moving to end the drought and the persecution. Fear that this confrontation could go wrong and make their situation even worse. Obadiah had no assurances to offer them. He did not know what would happen at Mount Carmel. He did not know if this was the beginning of deliverance or another terrible chapter in Israel's descent. All he knew was that he had done what Elijah asked. Against every instinct of self-preservation, despite all the rational arguments for refusing, he had obeyed. And he was still alive, still free, still able to continue his work, both public and private. For now, that was enough. Chapter 8. When giants confront and servants return to shadows. The gathering at Mount Carmel became the event that defined a generation. Obadiah heard about it through multiple sources. Official reports that came through palace channels, rumours and stories that servants whispered in corners, accounts from people who had been there, who had witnessed what happened with their own eyes. The stories all agreed on the basic facts, though they varied in details and emphasis. All Israel had assembled, not just officials and religious leaders, but common people from across the northern kingdom. They came in thousands, filling the slopes of Mount Carmel, creating a sea of humanity gathered to witness a confrontation between prophets. The 450 prophets of Baal had been there, confident and prepared. They had built their altar, prepared their sacrifice, and spent hours calling on their God. From morning until late afternoon, they had danced, chanted, cut themselves to show devotion, pleaded with Baal to send fire and consume their offering. Nothing had happened. The silence from heaven had been deafening. No fire, no response, no sign that their God even existed or cared about their desperate pleas. Then Elijah had acted. He had repaired an old altar to the Lord that had been torn down. He had arranged wood carefully. He had prepared a bull for sacrifice. And then, in a move that seemed designed to make the miracle undeniable, he had ordered water poured over everything. 12 large jars of water in the middle of a drought, soaking the sacrifice, the wood, the stones. Water that filled a trench dug around the altar. The witnesses described how precious that water was, how shocking it was to see it used this way when people were dying of thirst, how the act itself seemed almost wasteful until they understood its purpose. Then Elijah had prayed, not for hours, not with elaborate ceremonies or self-harm, just a simple, direct prayer asking the Lord to reveal himself, to show Israel that he was God, and fire had fallen from heaven. The descriptions of this moment varied, but the core fact remained consistent. Fire had consumed not just the sacrifice and the wood, but the stones of the altar itself. The water in the trench had evaporated. Everything had been burned completely. The people had fallen on their faces. Thousands of voices had cried out in unison, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The prophets of Baal had been seized. In the aftermath of such a dramatic demonstration, with the people's faith in the Lord reignited, Elijah had ordered their execution. All 450 had been killed in the Kishon Valley, and then, that very afternoon, clouds had formed. After 3 years of relentless drought, rain had come. Not a light shower, but a heavy downpour. The sky that had been closed for so long had opened. Water that the land desperately needed had fallen in abundance. Obadiah processed all of this information with complex emotions. Relief that the drought had finally ended. Gratitude that God had acted so powerfully. Hope that perhaps the persecution of faithful prophets would diminish. But also concern about what this meant for the immediate future. The palace erupted into chaos when news reached Samaria. Jezebel, hearing that her prophets had been slaughtered, went into a rage that terrified even those accustomed to her anger. She sent a message to Elijah swearing that she would have him killed within 24 hours, that he would join her prophets in death. The prophet fled again. After such a dramatic victory, after calling down fire and ending the drought, Elijah ran for his life. It seemed anticlimactic, almost disappointing, but Obadiah understood. One miracle did not change the political reality. Jezebel still had power. She still controlled significant military resources, and she was absolutely committed to vengeance. Ahab seemed caught between relief at the returning rain and fear of his wife's fury. He did not openly oppose Jezebel's threats against Elijah, but he also did not enthusiastically support them. The king appeared uncertain, perhaps recognizing that the demonstration at Mount Carmel had proven something important, even if he was not ready to fully embrace its implications. For Obadiah, life returned to a new version of normal. The palace still needed administration. The kingdom, now receiving rain, needed coordination to take advantage of the changed conditions. Fields needed to be planted. Systems needed to be restored. There was endless work to do. But the political dynamics had shifted. The absolute dominance of Baal worship had been challenged publicly. People had seen fire fall from heaven in response to Elijah's prayer. Even those who might not embrace full faith in the Lord could not deny what had happened. This created space for the hidden prophets to begin emerging. Not all at once. The situation was still dangerous. Jezebel's anger had not diminished. Her willingness to kill those who opposed her religious vision remained absolute. But the climate had changed enough that some of the prophets could cautiously return to public life. Obadiah continued providing for those who remained in hiding, while helping facilitate the quiet return of others. It was delicate work requiring the same political navigation that had characterized all his efforts. He connected returning prophets with communities that would receive them. He used his palace influence to provide some level of protection. He worked to rebuild networks of faithful teachers that had been shattered by persecution. The caves slowly emptied. First a few prophets left, then more. Some returned to families they had not seen in years. Others went to different cities, starting over in places where they were not known. A few stayed in hiding longer, too traumatized or too afraid to trust that the danger had truly passed. Obadiah visited the caves regularly through this transition period. Each time there were fewer men. Each time the chambers felt less like desperate hiding places and more like what they actually were, just caves. The final prophet left months after Mount Carmel. He was an older man who had struggled with illness during the hiding. He needed extra time to regain strength before travelling. Obadiah made a last delivery of supplies, helped the man prepare for his journey, and watched him walk away into freedom. Then Obadiah stood alone in the empty cave. 3 years of constant trips, thousands of loaves of bread, countless jugs of water, all the fear, the exhaustion, the risk. And now it was over. He felt strangely empty. The mission that had consumed his life was complete. The prophets were safe. The voice of God had not been silenced in Israel. Everything he had worked for had been accomplished. But there was no celebration, no acknowledgement. The world moved on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Obadiah walked back to Samaria and resumed his palace duties. The same work, the same people, the same routines, as if he had not spent years living a secret life that saved 100 people from death. Epilogue: the faith that lives in secret places. There is no monument to Obadiah. No temple bears his name. No festival celebrates his courage. No songs commemorate his actions. The stories that were passed down through generations of Israel focus on other figures. Elijah calling down fire, Elijah praying for rain, Elijah confronting kings and exposing false prophets. Those are the dramatic narratives that capture imagination. Those are the stories told to children and remembered in worship. Those are the accounts that teach clear lessons about God's power and faithfulness. But in the margins of those spectacular events, in the quiet spaces between the miracles, there was Obadiah, a man who never called down fire, a man who never stood before crowds, a man whose faith was expressed not through dramatic confrontations, but through the grinding daily work of keeping people alive. 100 prophets survived the persecution because of him. They were able to teach again, to train the next generation, to preserve the knowledge and wisdom of faith in the Lord. When the spectacular confrontation at Mount Carmel happened, those 100 prophets were still alive to witness it, still able to help rebuild faithful teaching in Israel, still available to continue the work they had been called to do, all because a palace administrator made choices no one saw, because he risked everything to hide teachers of truth, because he understood that sometimes obedience looks like logistics rather than miracles. His name appears only briefly in the historical records, a few verses in a longer narrative about Elijah, a footnote to someone else's story. Most people who read the account of Mount Carmel never even notice Obadiah's role. He is background, mentioned in passing, immediately forgotten as the narrative rushes toward more dramatic events. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be, because Obadiah's faith was not about being remembered. It was not about recognition or legacy or having his story celebrated. It was about doing what needed to be done when no one was watching, about choosing righteousness when it would never be publicly acknowledged, about serving God in the shadows while others served in the light. There is a temptation to think that faith which matters must be visible, that courage requires an audience, that righteousness should come with recognition. We want our sacrifices acknowledged, our struggles validated, our choices affirmed by others. But the kingdom of God operates differently. Some of the most essential work happens in complete obscurity. Some of the greatest acts of faithfulness are never recorded in any history. Some people serve with such profound quietness that their names are barely remembered, and God sees it all. Every midnight journey to caves, every risk taken in silence, every moment of choosing right when no one was watching to praise the choice, every loaf of bread delivered, every jug of water carried, every prayer whispered in fear, every decision to continue when quitting would have been easier. God saw Obadiah's faith. Not just the big moments like the encounter with Elijah on the road, but the thousands of small moments, the daily choices to get up and continue, the nights of fear and doubt when he questioned whether any of it mattered, the exhaustion of living a double life, the burden of carrying secrets that could destroy him. God saw the man who brought bread to caves while prophets called down fire from heaven, and in the economy of God's kingdom, both were necessary, both mattered, both played essential roles in the larger story of faith survival in a hostile land. The spectacular and the mundane, the public and the secret, the prophet who stood before nations and the administrator who walked quietly through the night, all working together, often without knowing it, to accomplish God's purposes. Obadiah could not have known how his actions would matter. He could not see the larger picture. He only knew that 100 men needed food, and he was in a position to help them. That simple understanding acted upon consistently despite enormous risk changed the course of Israel's spiritual history. Years later, when those 100 prophets were teaching in towns across Israel, were any of them still thinking about the man who fed them in caves? Did they tell their students about the palace administrator who risked everything? Did Obadiah's name come up in their prayers? We do not know. The historical record is silent on such details, but it does not matter. Their memory or gratitude was not why Obadiah did what he did. He did not serve for recognition. He served because it was right, because men were hungry and he could feed them, because lives were endangered and he could protect them, because God had placed him in a position where he could make a difference, and he chose to use that position for righteousness. That is the faith that survives in shadows, the faith that persists when there are no miracles to sustain it, the faith that shows up consistently, quietly, dangerously, and keeps showing up even when, exhausted and afraid and uncertain whether any of it matters. It matters. Every act of hidden obedience matters. Every secret choice for righteousness matters. Every moment of faithfulness that no one sees except God matters profoundly. Because God does not measure faith by its visibility. He measures it by its faithfulness. And Obadiah, palace administrator, secret provider, guardian of hidden prophets, was faithful. The rain eventually came. The drought ended. The nation slowly recovered from years of judgment. Prophets emerged from hiding and returned to their work. Life continued, and Obadiah returned to his regular duties, his secret mission complete, his name fading into the background of more dramatic stories. But in 2 caves outside Samaria, in the empty chambers where 100 men had hidden, the evidence of his faith remained. The makeshift living spaces, the places where supplies had been stored, the physical remnants of a rescue operation that saved lives and preserved truth. That is enough. More than enough. That is faith lived in the shadows, faith that does not demand light, faith that serves without seeking recognition, faith that looks, to anyone paying attention, remarkably like love. And in the end, perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the greatest acts of faith are simply acts of love, done consistently in secret for people who cannot repay, in service to a God who sees everything, even in the darkness of caves, even in the silence of hidden obedience, even in the life of man whose name most people never learned. God sees, God knows, God remembers. And that in the end is all the recognition that really matters, the spectacular moments of faith, the times when fire falls from heaven and nations bow in recognition. Those are important. They teach us about God's power. They remind us that he acts in history. They provide clear evidence of divine intervention. But the quiet moments of faith, the hidden choices for righteousness, the secret acts of obedience, these teach us something equally important. They show us that God values faithfulness more than fame. They remind us that our work matters even when no one sees it. They prove that ordinary people in ordinary positions can do extraordinary things simply by choosing to obey. Obadiah was not a prophet. He was not a king. He was not a warrior or a miracle worker. He was an administrator who used his administrative skills to save lives. He was a man of faith who expressed that faith through logistics and risk management and careful political navigation. And God used him to preserve the very voice that would later cool down fire on Mount Carmel. Without Obadiah, there might have been no prophets left to witness Elijah's victory. Without his quiet rescue, the teaching and wisdom of faithful men might have been lost entirely. Without his dangerous obedience done in secret year after year, the spiritual landscape of Israel might have been even more devastated than it was. But he did what he did, not seeking glory, not expecting reward, just because it was right and he was able. That is the kind of faith that changes the world, even when the world never knows your name. Rest well tonight, knowing that your faithfulness matters, that your hidden choices for righteousness are seen, that your secret obedience counts in ways you may never understand. Because if God could use a palace administrator to save prophets and preserve his word through the darkest time in Israel's history, he can use you exactly where you are doing exactly what he has given you to do, even if no one ever knows, even if you are never recognized, even if your story becomes a footnote to someone else's narrative. God sees, and that is enough. Hello, dear soul, and welcome to tonight's sacred story. Before we begin, I'd love to gently invite you to share. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it as you begin to rest? It's always beautiful to see how far this quiet circle of peace and God's word stretches around the world. And if you find peace and comfort tonight in this gentle story, please consider subscribing to Sacred Rest, where you can drift into sleep surrounded by scripture, stillness, and the tender presence of God. Now, take a slow, calming breath and settle in. Tonight, we walk through golden fields of faith as we enter the book of Ruth. In the gentle hills of Judah, beneath a sky that once poured abundance upon the land, the town of Bethlehem, whose name itself means house of bread, had become a place of emptiness. The fields lay parched, the grain stores depleted, and hunger walked freely through the streets that once overflowed with harvest songs. In one small home, a woman named Naomi whispered prayers as she packed what little remained of her family's possessions. Her husband Elimelech stood at the threshold, his eyes fixed on the horizon, toward the land of Moab where rumours of plenty had reached their desperate ears. Their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, young men with dreams still unformed, helped secure their meagre belongings for the journey ahead. "Is this truly what Yahweh wishes for us?" Naomi asked softly, her hands trembling slightly as she folded a well-worn shawl. "To leave the land of our fathers?" Elimelech's voice was gentle but firm. Sometimes faith means following the path of provision wherever it leads. We go to survive, beloved. We go to live. And so they set out, a small family among many who sought survival beyond their homeland's borders. The road stretched long before them, a winding path into uncertainty. With each step away from Bethlehem, Naomi felt the weight of leaving grow heavier, like gathering storm clouds behind them. Moab received them with fields less barren than those they had left. They built a simple life there, foreigners in a strange land that worshipped strange gods. They kept to themselves, honouring the Sabbath in quiet ways, speaking of Yahweh in evening whispers when the day's work was done. But sorrow knows no boundaries, respects no borders. It found them even there, across the Dead Sea from their homeland. First came the quiet, unexpected night when Elimelech did not wake with the dawn. Naomi wept as they buried him according to their customs, as best they could in foreign soil. Her sons stood like slender reeds on either side of her, bending in the wind of grief but not breaking. Time continued its patient march. The sons found wives among the Moabite women. Mahlon married Ruth, a woman with gentle eyes and a voice like summer rain. Chilion took Orpah, whose laughter could brighten even their darkest days of longing for home. For 10 years they lived thus, not in abundance, but in enough, until enough became too little and the shadows returned. First Mahlon grew ill, his strength fading like evening light. Then Chilion, as if unable to walk this world without his brother, followed him into that quiet night from which no traveller returns. 3 widows remained, their grief a shared language that needed no translation. When news reached them that the famine had lifted in Judah, Naomi's heart turned homeward. What remained for her in this land of sorrows? Better to die in the place of her birth, among her own people, than to continue as a stranger in a land that had taken everything she loved. "Go back," she told her daughters-in-law, her voice thick with both love and sorrow. "Return to your mothers' homes. May Yahweh deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." She kissed them farewell, and the 3 women wept together, their tears mingling like rivers converging. Orpah's departure was a slow, reluctant walking away, her form growing smaller on the horizon, turning back once, twice, before finally disappearing around a bend in the road. But Ruth stayed. When Naomi urged her again to follow Orpah's path, Ruth's embrace tightened, her voice steady despite her tears. "Do not urge me to leave you," she whispered, the words flowing from somewhere deeper than thought. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Yahweh deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Naomi, who had thought herself empty of all feeling save grief, felt something stir within her breast, small as a mustard seed, fragile as a sparrow's first flight. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. And so they walked together, two widows on the road to Bethlehem, Naomi returning, Ruth arriving. The older woman's steps were heavy with memories, the younger's light with the strange freedom that comes from choosing one's path with complete clarity. They arrived as the barley harvest was beginning, the fields around Bethlehem rippling like a green sea in the gentle breeze. Women drawing water recognized Naomi despite the years and sorrows that had reshaped her face. "Can this be Naomi?" they asked, voices bright with surprise. "Do not call me Naomi," she replied, the name that meant pleasant now a bitter irony on her tongue. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but Yahweh has brought me back empty." As the women of Bethlehem welcomed them with curious eyes and hesitant embraces, Ruth stood quietly by Naomi's side, her hand a steady presence on the older woman's arm. In this moment, on this threshold between past and future, neither could know what fields of possibility lay before them, what harvest Yahweh was already preparing, or how their names would one day be spoken with reverence across centuries yet unborn. They knew only this: the road behind them was empty, and the road ahead unknown, but they would walk it together, step by faithful step, beneath the watchful eyes of a God who sees even sparrows when they fall. The sun had barely lifted itself above the eastern hills when Ruth rose from her mat, careful not to disturb Naomi's rare peaceful sleep. The small house they had secured, more a room than a home, was cool in the early morning light, shadows still clinging to the corners like reluctant dreams. Ruth wrapped herself in a shawl, the fabric thin but serviceable, and tied back her hair with practiced movements. She had been a daughter of comfort in Moab. Now she was a gleaner in a foreign land. The transition might have broken someone with less resilience, but Ruth had discovered a quiet strength within herself, not the kind that roars or demands attention, but the kind that simply continues, putting one foot before the other when all other options have vanished. "I will go to the fields today," she had told Naomi the night before. "Perhaps someone will allow me to glean behind their harvesters." Naomi had nodded, gratitude and sorrow mingling in her tired eyes. "Go, my daughter," she had whispered. "May Yahweh guide your steps." Now, as Ruth stepped into the awakening streets of Bethlehem, she carried those words like a small flame against the uncertainty of the day ahead. The law of Moses provided for the poor, the widow, the foreigner. They were permitted to gather what the harvesters missed or deliberately left behind. It was not charity but dignity, the way of working for one's bread even when one owned no land. But Ruth was doubly vulnerable, both widow and foreigner. Which field would welcome her? Would the law's protection extend to a Moabite woman? These questions followed her like shadows as she made her way to the edges of town where the barley fields began their gentle roll toward the horizon. She paused at the boundary of the first field she encountered, watching as workers began to form lines, their sickles catching the morning light with brief flashes of brilliance. The field's owner was not present, but the foreman eyed her with suspicion. "Move along," he called, not unkindly but firmly. "We have enough local gleaners already." Ruth nodded and continued, her heart sinking slightly but her resolve undiminished. The second field brought similar results. By the time she reached the third, the sun had climbed higher, and her throat was dry with thirst and unspoken prayers. This field seemed different somehow. The workers moved with a relaxed efficiency, and there was conversation, even occasional laughter among them. Ruth hesitated, then approached the foreman, her eyes modestly lowered but her voice clear. "Please, sir," she said, "might I glean among the sheaves behind your harvesters? I will be careful not to disturb their work." The foreman studied her for a long moment, noting her foreign accent, the quality of her garments that spoke of better days now past. Something in her demeanour, a dignity that hardship had failed to diminish, made him nod slowly. "You may," he said. "Stay close to my servant girls, drink from our water jars when you thirst, and rest in the shade when the sun grows too fierce." Ruth's gratitude was a physical sensation, warm in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're most kind to a stranger." The work was harder than anything she'd done before, bending, searching, gathering the scattered stalks left behind. The sun climbed higher, its heat a heavy blanket across the fields. The other gleaners, mostly local widows and their children, kept their distance, though their curious glances sometimes found her. But Ruth worked steadily. Her determination measured in each stalk added to her growing bundle. By midday she'd gathered enough to make the effort worthwhile, though her back ached and her hands were rough with new blisters. She was resting briefly in the shadow of a large sycamore at the field's edge when a commotion among the workers drew her attention. A man had arrived, tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. The foreman hurried to greet him, and the workers called out blessings. "The Lord be with you," the man responded, his voice carrying across the field. "The Lord bless you," they answered in unison. This, then, was the owner of the field where Ruth had found favour. She watched as he moved among his people, speaking to each, asking after families, offering words that brought smiles to weary faces. There was something different about him, a kindness that seemed as natural as breathing. When his circuit of the field brought him near where Ruth rested, he paused, his gaze falling on her with quiet curiosity. "Who is this young woman?" he asked his foreman. "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi," the man replied. "She asked permission to glean behind the harvesters. She has worked steadily since morning, with only this brief rest." The owner, Boaz was his name, Ruth heard someone nearby whisper, approached her then. Instinctively she rose and bowed slightly, uncertain of the proper protocol but determined to show respect. "Listen, my daughter," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Do not go to glean in another field. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch where they harvest and follow them. I have told the men not to touch you, and when you are thirsty, drink from the jars the men have filled." Ruth's surprise made her bold. She bowed lower, her voice barely audible even to herself. "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz's answer was unexpected in its thoughtfulness. "I have been told all that you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death, how you left your father and mother and your homeland to come to a people you did not know before. May Yahweh repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." His words washed over Ruth like cool water on a parched day. For so long she'd been defined by what she had lost: husband, homeland, security. Now, for the first time, someone saw what she'd chosen, what she had given, what she had become. "You have put me at ease, my lord," she said, her voice steadier now. "You have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." When the meal break came, Boaz himself invited her to share bread with the harvesters. He handed her roasted grain, more than she could eat, and she saved some for Naomi. Throughout the afternoon, Ruth noticed that the harvesters seemed to be dropping more grain than seemed accidental. Once she caught the foreman's eye as he instructed a worker to deliberately leave a small bundle behind. He looked away quickly, but not before she glimpsed something like approval in his gaze. When evening came and Ruth gathered her gleaning, an ephah of barley, far more than she had dared hope for, she felt something she had not expected to feel again. The quiet satisfaction of provision, of having enough for tomorrow. As she walked back toward Bethlehem, the setting sun painting the limestone buildings in shades of amber and rose, Ruth carried not just barley, but something weightier. The knowledge that in this strange new land, under the wings of a God she was still coming to know, she had been seen. Not as Naomi's burden, not as an unwelcome foreigner, but as someone worthy of kindness, and in the shadow of that kindness small seeds of possibility had begun to stir in the soil of her heart. The soft glow of oil lamps pushed back the evening darkness as Ruth entered the small dwelling she shared with Naomi. Her mother-in-law sat in the dimness, her hands, once strong and capable, now resting idle in her lap, testament to a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Is that you, my daughter?" Naomi called, her voice brightening slightly. "It is," Ruth answered, setting down her bundle with a soft thud. The sound seemed to fill the small space with promise. Naomi leaned forward, her eyes widening as Ruth opened the cloth to reveal the day's gleaning, golden barley catching the lamplight like treasure. "Where did you glean today?" she asked, running her fingers through the grain with wonder. "Blessed be the one who took notice of you." Ruth began to prepare a portion of the grain for their evening meal as she recounted the day's events, the field, the unexpected kindness, the owner who had spoken to her with respect rather than suspicion. "The man's name was Boaz," she finished, watching as something flickered across Naomi's face. Recognition, then a sudden animation that had been absent for so long. "Boaz!" Naomi exclaimed, her voice stronger than Ruth had heard it in months. "That man is a relative of ours, one of our guardian redeemers." "Guardian redeemer?" Ruth echoed, unfamiliar with the term. Naomi's eyes held a spark now, like embers rekindling. "In our laws, in our customs, a guardian redeemer is a relative who has the responsibility to protect the interests of the needy members of the extended family, to redeem property that has been sold in times of hardship, to continue the family line." Her voice trailed off, her thoughts clearly racing ahead of her words. "The Lord has not stopped showing his kindness," Naomi whispered, almost to herself. "That man is one of our closest relatives." As they ate their simple meal of roasted grain and water, Ruth noticed that Naomi ate with more appetite than she had shown since their return to Bethlehem. Occasionally, the older woman would pause, her head tilted slightly as if listening to distant music only she could hear. The barley harvest continued, and Ruth returned to Boaz's fields each day. True to his word, she was protected, provided for, included in the shared meals. Some of the local women began to speak to her, their initial wariness giving way to cautious friendship. Ruth learned their names, heard stories of their children, shared in the communal rhythm of the harvest. When the barley harvest gave way to wheat, she remained in Boaz's fields, her presence now familiar, her diligence respected. Each evening she returned to Naomi with her gleanings. Each morning she rose before dawn to begin again. As the wheat harvest neared its end, Naomi called Ruth to sit beside her one evening. The older woman's face was thoughtful, her voice quiet but determined. "My daughter," she began, "should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you have been working? See, he's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor." Ruth listened carefully as Naomi outlined a plan. Bold, unconventional, but rooted in custom and law. She was to bathe, anoint herself with fragrant oil, put on her best garment, and go to the threshing floor where Boaz would be sleeping to guard the harvest. After he had eaten and drunk and lain down, she was to uncover his feet and lie down there, a symbolic gesture, a quiet request for protection. "All that you say I will do," Ruth promised. though her heart fluttered with uncertainty. She trusted Naomi's wisdom, trusted that this was not a plan born of desperation but of genuine care and cultural understanding. That night, the stars seemed to hang lower in the sky as Ruth made her way to the threshing floor. The celebration of harvest's end was winding down. Men who had worked hard now rested deeply, their forms dark shapes against the pale circle of the threshing floor. She moved quietly, carefully, finding Boaz where he slept at the edge of a heap of grain. With trembling hands she uncovered his feet and lay down, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might wake him before the right moment. The night air was cool, the ground hard beneath her, but Ruth remained still, waiting. Near midnight, Boaz stirred, startled to find someone at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep but not angry. "I am Ruth, your servant," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, for you are a guardian redeemer." There was a long silence during which Ruth could hear only her own heartbeat and the distant call of a night bird. Then Boaz spoke, his voice warm with emotion she hadn't expected. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he said gently. "This kindness is greater than what you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor, and now don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." His words washed over her like a blessing, affirming not just her request but her person, her character, her choices, her worth. "It is true that I am a guardian redeemer," he continued, his voice thoughtful, "but there is a guardian redeemer more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Now, lie here until morning." Ruth lay at his feet until dawn began to paint the eastern sky with the first pale colours of day. Before it was light enough for people to recognize each other, Boaz gently woke her. "Let it not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor," he said, practical and protective. Then he measured out 6 measures of barley, a generous gift, a promise of more to come, and placed it in her shawl. "Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed," he explained. When Ruth returned and recounted the night's events, Naomi's eyes shone with a mixture of tenderness and satisfaction. "Wait, my daughter," she counselled, "until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." And as the morning light filled their small home, Ruth felt a strange peace settle over her. Not the peace of certainty, for much remained unresolved, but the peace that comes from having taken a step in faith, from having placed one's future in hands both human and divine. Outside, the streets of Bethlehem were coming to life. Somewhere in the town, Boaz was already moving toward the city gate, where matters of law and redemption were settled. Whatever the day would bring, Ruth knew that she had been seen, heard and valued, not despite her foreignness, her widowhood, her poverty, but somehow mysteriously, because of the person these circumstances had revealed her to be. And in that knowledge, she found a quiet strength to wait, to hope, to trust in the unfolding of a story that suddenly seemed larger than her own life. A story written in fields of barley and wheat, in promises spoken in the darkness, in the steadfast love of a God who sees the sparrow fall and counts the hairs on every head. The morning light spilled across Bethlehem like honey warm and golden. Boaz had risen early, his mind filled with purpose, his heart with a mixture of hope and determination. He made his way to the town gate, the place where elders gathered, where business was conducted, where justice was administered in full view of the community. He had barely settled himself when the guardian redeemer he had mentioned to Ruth approached. "Come over here, my friend," Boaz called, motioning to a seat beside him. Sit down here." The man complied, curious about this formal invitation. Boaz then gathered 10 elders of the town, asking them to sit as witnesses. What was about to transpire was no small matter. It concerned inheritance, redemption, the continuation of a family line that had nearly been extinguished. "Naomi, who has returned from Moab," Boaz began carefully, "is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people." The relative's eyes brightened with interest. Land was wealth, security, legacy. "I will redeem it," he said promptly. But Boaz was not finished. His next words were measured, precise, laying out the full implications of redemption. "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." The relative's expression shifted. To redeem the land was one thing, a sound investment, but to marry Ruth meant dividing his own inheritance, complicating his family line. His enthusiasm visibly cooled. "Then I cannot redeem it," he said. "Because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." To formalize the transaction, the man removed his sandal, an ancient custom signifying the transfer of redemption rights. "Buy it yourself," he said, handing the sandal to Boaz. Boaz turned to the elders and all the people gathered at the gate. "Today you are witnesses," he declared, his voice carrying across the morning stillness, "that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown." The elders and all at the gate responded with one voice, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Dia." Their blessing echoed against the stone walls of Bethlehem, a public proclamation of hope and expectation. In that moment, among witnesses and with proper legal procedure, Ruth's journey from widow to wife, from foreigner to family, from gleaner to landowner was complete. When Boaz returned to tell Ruth what had transpired, he found her helping Naomi prepare the midday meal, her movements graceful despite the humble task. At the sight of him in the doorway, both women paused, their eyes questioning. "It is done," he said simply. "All that I promised has been accomplished." Ruth's marriage to Boaz was celebrated with the quiet joy of those who have known sorrow and found unexpected sweetness on the other side. Naomi, who had returned to Bethlehem empty, now found herself part of a home filled with new beginnings. The seasons turned, bringing change to the land and to the small family. When Ruth's time came to deliver her first child, the women of Bethlehem gathered around her. The same women who had once whispered about the foreign daughter-in-law, now offering support and wisdom as she laboured. The child was a son, strong and healthy. They placed him in Naomi's arms, this woman who had lost both husband and sons, who had called herself bitter and empty. Now, as she cradled her grandson, the women of Bethlehem blessed her. "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." They named the child Obed, which means serving or worshipping, a name that spoke of gratitude, of recognition that this child was not just the continuation of a family line, but a gift from a God who sees the end from the beginning. What none of them could know, as they celebrated the birth with bread and wine and laughter, was that this child, Obed would one day be the grandfather of David, the shepherd boy who would become Israel's greatest king. And from David's line centuries later would come the Messiah, the ultimate redeemer, whose story of love and sacrifice would echo Ruth's loyalty and Boaz's redemption on a cosmic scale. As Boaz watched Ruth with their son, he marvelled at the intricate weaving of their lives, how sorrow had led to joy, how loss had opened the door to finding, how endings had become beginnings. He thought of the day he had first noticed Ruth in his fields, her quiet dignity as she gleaned among the sheaves. How could he have known then what this foreign woman would come to mean not only to him, but to the future of his people? In the soft twilight of their home, with Naomi singing gentle lullabies to Obed and Ruth's hand warm in his own, Boaz understood that some harvests are gathered not in fields of grain, but in the human heart, in acts of kindness, in choices of loyalty, in the courage to begin again when all seems lost. Outside their window, the hills of Bethlehem were turning purple with evening shadows. Somewhere in those hills, shepherds watched their flocks. Stars began their nightly vigil, and the world continued its ancient rhythms of planting and harvest, of birth and death, of loss and redemption. But within this one small home, within these few beating hearts, a miracle had occurred. The quiet, everyday miracle of restoration, of empty hands being filled again, of bitter lives turning sweet, of a future reclaimed from the ashes of the past. And as night fell over Bethlehem, as oil lamps were lit and evening prayers whispered, as the infant Obed drifted into sleep secure in the knowledge of being utterly loved, the story of Ruth and Boaz, of faithful love and kindness reciprocated, became another golden thread in the tapestry of faith that would one day welcome the world's Redeemer. The stars appeared one by one in the deepening blue of the evening sky, like silver seeds scattered across a celestial field. In homes throughout Bethlehem, oil lamps cast their gentle glow against limestone walls, and families gathered for evening meals, for prayers, for the sharing of the day's small victories and concerns. In one such home, the home of Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi, the day was drawing to its peaceful close. Little Obed, now a toddler with his father's strong build and his mother's gentle eyes, had been tucked into bed after a story from his grandmother Naomi. His breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of childhood sleep, innocent and complete. Ruth sat in the courtyard, her fingers working methodically at a loom, creating fabric for their household. The rhythmic movement of the shuttle was soothing, meditative, a dance between yarn and skill that produced something both beautiful and necessary. Boaz watched her from the doorway, struck again by the quiet grace that had first drawn him to her in the fields. "Your hands create such beauty," he said softly, joining her in the cool evening air. Ruth smiled, her eyes never leaving her work. "My mother taught me to weave when I was a child," she replied. "She said that the making of cloth is like the making of a life, thread by thread, day by day, until a pattern emerges that was invisible at the beginning." Naomi appeared in the doorway, carrying a small cup of wine. "The child sleeps," she announced, her voice warm with contentment. "He asked again for the story of how his mother came from a distant land." "And did you tell him?" Boaz asked, making room for Naomi on the bench beside him. "I did," Naomi nodded, taking a small sip of wine. "I told him how Ruth chose love over safety, how she gleaned in the fields, how you noticed her and showed kindness." "He likes that part," Ruth added with a smile, "the part where his father was the hero." Boaz shook his head gently. "If there is a hero in our story, beloved, it is not I. It is you who left everything familiar to follow Naomi. It is Naomi who endured loss upon loss, yet found the strength to return home. It is the Lord who guided each step, though we could not see the path ahead. The three sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The night air was cool but not cold, fragrant with the scent of ripened fruit from the small orchard that bordered their property. In the distance, a shepherd's flute played a melancholy tune, its notes drifting over the sleeping town like a blessing. "Do you ever think," Naomi said eventually, her voice thoughtful, "of how differently things might have unfolded if the famine had never come, if my sons had lived, if Ruth had returned to her mother's house as Orpah did?" Boaz reached for Ruth's hand, his calloused palm enveloping her smaller one. "I think of it often," he admitted. "How 1,000 different choices, 1,000 different circumstances might have led us all elsewhere. Yet here we are, brought together by both sorrow and joy." Ruth set aside her weaving, her eyes reflecting the first bright stars. "In Moab," she said softly, "we had a saying, 'The path to the garden often leads through the desert.' I did not understand it fully until I lived it." "And now?" Naomi asked. "Now I understand that sometimes the desert is necessary," Ruth answered. "Sometimes the empty road, the lonely field, the long night of waiting, these are not detours from God's plan, but the very path itself." Boaz nodded, his face solemn in the gathering darkness. "When I was a younger man," he said, "I often questioned why the Lord had not blessed me with a wife, with children. I watched my friends build families while I built barns and storehouses. I wondered if I had somehow missed the fullness of life." He looked at Ruth, his eyes soft with wonder even after these years together. "Now I see that I was waiting for you, though I did not know it. That each harvest I oversaw, each field I planted, was preparation for the day when a Moabite widow would come to glean among my sheaves." Naomi's laugh was gentle, without bitterness. "And I, who accused the Lord of emptying my hands, look what he has filled them with." She gestured toward the house where Obed slept, toward the small but thriving household that had grown around her. Sometimes emptiness is just the space God is creating for something new. As they sat together in the deepening twilight, a sense of reverent gratitude settled over them. Not the loud exuberance of those who have never known loss, but the deeper, quieter joy of those who have walked through shadows and found light waiting on the other side. The tale of their lives, this unexpected family, formed from fragments of broken dreams, would be told and retold through generations. Not because it was extraordinary in its outward circumstances, but because it revealed an extraordinary truth, that in the hands of a loving God nothing is wasted. Not grief, not loyalty, not kindness, not love freely given with no expectation of return. In the quiet darkness of Bethlehem, as the household of Boaz and Ruth prepared for sleep, they could not know how their story would echo through time, how the great-grandson of their son would be anointed king of Israel, how from their lineage would come the promised Messiah. They knew only this, that the God who had led them through famine and loss, through foreign fields and threshing floors, through legal proceedings and new beginnings,